Good afternoon, Manish and Andy. Let's go through this week's intro together. And I'm going to start with this week's top 10 most reports. Like as you see, there a little bit of movement, and especially in the top five, there's not much movement. There are always regular ports and services. For instance, number one is taken by the Telnet port 23. 3 is by SMP 445. 4 is followed by 22, which is SSS port, and 5 is 443. But the interesting things which jumped out to me for the week ending yesterday is at the 7th and 9th and 10th positioned ports, which is 11.211 TCP, 4.5.6.7 TCP, and 1.6.9.9.3 TCP. I have flu sites. I want to go through a little bit of what we are seeing from internet perspective and what are the services running on it. Okay, let's start with the 11.211 TCP, which is actually registered to Memcached daemon, basically, where D is for the daemon here in this case. It came to prominence maybe a couple of years ago as they're heavily used. I think it's one of the newer avenues they found to use reflective attacks. For example, all the times we used to see NTP and others as the primary reflective DDoS attack vectors. But in this case, the amplification is much, much higher. And actually, you can bring much responses to a small packet sent to the unknowing victims. I think that's what the Memcached attacks are used for. But here in this case, looking at the graph from our telemetry data, it's about looking back the past 60 days of the data. On x-axis, you have the timeline, whereas on the y-axis, you have the count of the scanning flows per hour. I think when you see here, there's peaks happening at the regular intervals. I think I went back for the past 6 weeks. Every time, I think at the start of Sunday, late Sunday or early mornings of Monday, there's a huge spike coming up. I believe in this scenario, I think some sort of botnets or something, they're scanning and looking at the data and they're capturing and they're going into dormant. And again, they're coming back to alive and doing the scanning maybe on the 6th day or the 7th day. And this pattern seems to be continuing. I went back up to 90 days, past 90 days, but I included only 60 days. Like as you see, this is the similar pattern being observed for the past few months. Now, pivoting to the number of unique scanners happening on this specific port. These are also pretty much consistent throughout the last 60 days. Also, again, spikes happening a couple of times. I think there were huge spikes at the early of December and also just the start of this year. I do not know what they really were, but I think it happened and they kind of quieted for some time again. They kind of picked up on the Sunday evening again. Looking at the reports, what we have, it doesn't seem to be highly occurring at this time, but I couldn't able to figure it out. Is it really DDoS activity or it's just a scanning? But looking at one of the reports, like you say here, I think in this case, I could able to figure it out, 22 scanners occurring on this specific port looking for most likely this 11.211 TCP. And most likely along with this one, the UDP counterpart for 11,211 UDP port also. I think in the DDoS attacks, UDP counterpart is much vulnerable. I think brings lots of bandwidth compared to the TCP. But nevertheless, both the ports will be open if somebody is running Memcached. I think in this scenario, I believe they're probably building up the vulnerable systems list and probably for future attacks or something like that. So moving on. Next one I have on the list is 4.5.6.7 TCP. Again, this is a very common port, I think most likely used by lots of devices. For example, FiOS uses for internet gateways and the web servers. I think most of these devices are produced by Actiontec, but nevertheless, it could be used by some other DSL servers also. What's happening in this scenario? Again, 60 days, not much activity. Again, some activities happening at certain points of time. I believe botnets are coming up, scanning the entire internet, bringing up the list, and again, actually, they're going into the dormant phase until that specific date to scan the whole internet is coming up. Same deal here again. The scanners, the number of scanners are not really huge. I think on an average they were around 20 to 30 any hour of the day, but sometimes they're peaking up to be 350 to 450 scan sources per hour. And again, as you can see, uh, it's heavily concentrated in, I believe, in North America and some other regions. I think that's where the presence of this, I guess, Actiontec routers are heavily used. But other than that, nothing significant can be contributed, something happening here. But it is on our watch list to see if it's something is coming up. The reason is, again, these Actiontec devices, if you flip it on the other side, it's kind of IoT device, right? So it's a prime target again for the hackers. I think they're looking for any ports open on these specific devices and maybe further exploit it.
Yeah, I think I'm just, it's always concerning when you see something like this on where there's an existing device out there, like a router. Did someone discover some sort of zero-day vulnerability on these devices? And it just remains to be seen if this ends up getting exploited, and what's the reason for this scan activity. I think is always the issue and the big spike. I wonder if it's, is it the spike? Did it spike because when you ran your report, it just happened to be on a time where it spiked, or is this just something, that kind of crept up recently?
I think it's kind of crept up recently because it never cracked into the top, especially these three ports I'm discussing
Right.
here. They never crept into the top 10. Even scanning wise, I think most likely in the volume wise also. I think the way we look at the data, I think it basically jumped into the top 10. But by looking at you can see the trend, but not really, I think, worth to say that something malicious happening or maybe something about to happen. But definitely it brought us onto our horizon on the radar, basically, especially 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm really interested to watch this port because it's used by FiOS routers and devices, right? And they're most prevalent, especially in North America. And if somebody found some backdoor, I think the number of users or devices, maybe networks, basically multiplies. That's a huge vector to basically exploit. That's one reason. But other than that, nothing could be concretely correlated. Maybe from our analysis, we couldn't able to solidly say this is what it is. But it's a scanning is happening. There are lots of scanners. I mean, well-known scanners as well as some scanning activity occurring on these two ports. Okay, then I'll move on to the next one. I just put it there. I never seen this port come up, 16993 TCP, and apparently it's used by Intel for active management technology. I think Intel AMT uses a couple of ports besides 16993. I think 16992 and 16994. Basically, in this for it has 3 to 5 ports which uses with this one. What it is basically monitoring of management engine without the concern of the OS technology. I think in this sense, if somebody kind of found some sort of vulnerability in this one, they can pretty much own any system running Intel technology without the knowledge of the OS. I think that is the concern here for me. But as you see, it's very, very minor. The scans are happening and nothing is happening. Very, very minor scanning happening. I think it picked up because of probably the start of the year, and probably it doesn't have enough thresholding baseline to drop it into the bottom of the chart. I think I wanted to put it there to bring to the attention of the team. This could happen also. I researched a little bit. I think there was one vulnerability, but it is very, very old, and it has been taken care by Intel at that time. But But unlikely, we know that even though there are patches available, there are always some sort of scanning happening, and we always found some sort of vulnerable devices on internet. Another view, how many scan sources are involved. I guess at some point I only seen 2 scanners happening, and they are well-known scanners. I mean, that indicates that it's part of some automated scanning activity. I did not include the GeoIP map because of the low number of scanners. Moving on to the most sources probing for this week. On the top 10, again, no surprises here. It's the top 445, which is SMB, followed by 23 Telnet, and again 22 SSH, 80, which are HTTP-related ports. 1433 is MS SQL Server. 8291, 8728, 555, these are all related to IoT device vulnerabilities as well as scanning related to botnets. But today I would like to concentrate on SSH port as well as MS SQL Server port. Okay, how is the scanning activity looking on SSH port? I know the reason I picked up is we all know SSH as well as Telnet ports are one of the primary targets, heavily used by lots of botnets for finding out some vulnerabilities, maybe to gaining foothold into one of the corporates. I think this is one of the ports which will be targeted. So here, the scan flows, it seems to be okay. There's upward trend since last 3-4 days, but nothing much concern looking at the past 60 days. But when I pivoted into number of unique scanners, you're seeing there, you see basically a huge jump happening in the past 60 days. I mean, it kind of crept around, I think, just before the Christmas. Okay, it crept up a little bit since the last 2 to 4 days. It kind of jumped huge. I think now it is running into 24,000 at its peak. I'm still investigating at this point. It seems to be they're looking at open SSH ports with a specific payload, I guess. In this scenario, I've seen the different payloads, like varying from 40 bytes to maybe 64 bytes sometimes, so with the flags set to all the Christmas flag sets. In the sense, they have all of the TCP flags set with the purpose of looking back at the response, what they're going to get it. I think it's kind of some sort of OS fingerprint-based scanning, I believe, and it also blended with the regular scanning. I'm still looking at it. I think we will have more details in the coming weeks as we learn, but it's on my horizon to look into what's really happening in this scenario. And when we have such a huge spike, we kind of expect our GUI to be very busy. And in this scenario, I think one of the reports I picked up, it has close to 23,000 scan sources. And as you can see, they are all over the place. Basically, in some scenarios, some countries are basically, the IPs from specific region are completely basically scanned. So yeah, I mean, there are a couple you see in the ocean. I think that's how the latitude and longitude are calculated, but they're really not. They're not really in the ocean, but somewhere closer to the land only. That's a disclaimer. Any comments on this port 22 TCP?
It's just interesting to see like a 6-time increase over the normal pattern. That's that's pretty interesting that you picked that up. That's it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
It's pretty atypical, right? I think all last year, I don't think we saw a spike that big. I could be wrong, but the internet weather I saw, it certainly didn't have that spike.
I agree with you, Andy. I think most oftentimes we were seeing like IoT-based devices like 555. Those ports are constantly peaking up. Not especially with 22 or maybe even with 23 TCP. It's been a while we saw such a huge spike. So something needs to be looked at it by all of us. But we'll see what we'll come up with in the coming weeks. I'll move on to the next one, which is about 1433 TCP. As I said, it's related to Microsoft SQL Server port. Again, in the past 60 days, it's okay, normal traffic with scanning and spikes happening at regular interval. So pivoting on the 60 days of the scan sources, actually the number of scan sources are actually diminishing from the last 60 days. So it picked up, but nothing much to be contributed here. But I think, as always, the database servers and it's always a prime target because it's a trove of information about the data as well as maybe users. You'll get lots of information from these servers. I think it's also one of the reasons it's been heavily targeted by the bad actors. So again, it's not as busy as 22 TCP geo IP map, but nevertheless, it's also a very busy slide. You have about 13,000 scan sources. And again, some parts of the world, basically, they've been heavily scanned. I think whatever the IP, probably maybe 80 to 90% their IP address ranges are heavily scanned.
Wow, that's really interesting. I think it brings up more questions than answers this week.
Yeah, actually.